The Olympics were the greatest athletic event in ancient Greece, drawing people from all the city-states to witness and participate in them. They were the epitome of the ancient Greek athletic spirit that influenced thousands of people throughout the centuries and inspired the creation of the modern Olympic Games. In this video, we will delve deeply into the history of the Olympics, exploring how and when they were established, the procedures and program of the Games, and much more. Olympia is located in the northwest side of the Peloponnese Peninsula. It is a secluded and remote place surrounded by the rivers Alpheus and Cladius, with high mountains to the east and the Ionian Sea to the west. This rich land is filled with a great variety of trees, vineyards, and olive farms. Its secluded and rich nature made it a perfect place for founding a protected sanctuary. The use of the area for religious purposes began in the 11th century BC, when a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus was established and leaders from various tribes sent precious gifts. As time passed, the wealth of Olympia grew, and in the year 776 BC, according to most ancient Greek scholars, the first athletic event took place, marking the beginning of the first Olympiad. There are several stories about the origin of the Olympics, most of which are mixed with myths and legends. One of these tells that the gods themselves founded the Games. After Zeus defeated his father Cronus, a sprint race among the gods was established in Olympia. However, over time, the gods became secluded on Mount Olympus and barely interacted with humans, and so the Games were forgotten. Many centuries later, when the hero Heracles completed one of his 12 labors in a nearby city, he reinstated the Games in honor of his father Zeus. Another story tells of a king named Eunomaus who ruled over the region of Arcadia. Upon hearing a prophecy that he would be killed by his son-in-law, he declared that any man who wished to marry his daughter Hippodamia and inherit his kingdom must defeat him in a chariot race. Many men attempted the challenge, but they were all defeated and killed because the horses of Eunomaus were blessed by the god of war, Elis. The skulls of the defeated men were then displayed in the king's palace. One day, Pelops, son of Tantalus, challenged Eunomaus to a chariot race. The god Poseidon granted Pelops winged horses, and with this divine assistance, Pelops won the race. He then killed Eunomaus and married Hippodamia, establishing the Pelopid dynasty, whose descendants eventually became the kings of Mycenae. The Peloponnese Peninsula is named after Pelops, literally translating as the island of Pelops. Beyond the legendary tales that many ancient Greeks accepted as fact, there is a more plausible story regarding the origin of the Olympics that does not include any gods or mythical creatures. According to later ancient Greek historians, the Olympic Games were established by 3 kings: Iphitus of Elis, Cleisthenes of Pisa, and Lycurgus of Sparta. They were advised by the Oracle of Delphi to create an athletic event aimed at fostering healthy competition and suppressing the quarrels and fighting between their cities. It was agreed that a temporary truce or armistice would be established among the cities during the Games. Olympia was initially inhabited around 1400 BC, but was later abandoned. It was repopulated around the 11th century BC, as mentioned earlier, and served as a sacred site for the worship of Zeus and other Olympian gods. During this period, Olympia was primarily used for pilgrimage purposes and was not permanently inhabited. It was during the 8th century BC that the nearby city of Elis took control of the site and began constructing buildings, establishing a permanent settlement. The city-state of Elis was responsible for hosting the Olympic Games from their inception in the 8th century BC until their abolishment in the 4th century AD, with a few exceptions over the years when the rival city of Pisa briefly controlled the region. The main settlement was established in a location within Olympia called Altis, which in the northwest Doric dialect means sacred forest. Altus was filled with olive trees, plane trees, and poplars. This area is where the first altars, temples, and stadium were built, introducing the first Olympic Games, presumably in 776 BC. The games began as a local religious festival in honor of Zeus, lasting for one day and featuring only one sport, the sprint race, which remained the most honored event throughout Olympia's history. The games were scheduled to take place every 4 years, and the Greeks named each Olympiad with a consecutive number along with the name of the sprint race winner. Over the years, since different Greek tribes followed different calendars, the Olympiad often served as an all-Greek calendar to record important events. Over the next century, this local event began attracting people from various regions of Greece. It became evident that the settlement needed expansion, leading to the construction of new athletic facilities and the erection of a wall around the Altis. Additionally, many new temples and shrines were built, including the great temple of Zeus, which housed the famous statue of Zeus, considered one of the 7 wonders of antiquity. Along with these changes, many new sports were introduced to the games, including the long run, the pentathlon, boxing, and chariot races. By the 7th century BC, the Greeks had already begun establishing colonies throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Many of these colonies started participating in the Olympic Games, primarily to maintain connections with the mainland Greek states. This significantly contributed to the growing fame of the Olympics. In just a few decades, the Olympics had become the meeting point for nearly all Greeks, and the festival continued to grow in popularity for many more years. What started as a one-day event with one sport evolved into a 3-day festival featuring at least 10 sports. As we mentioned, the host of the games was the city-state of Elis, and Olympia was within its territory. The Eleans financed the games, provided the Olympic officials, and built the athletic and religious premises as well as the administrative buildings. In this sense, the event was overseen by a single Greek city-state, but it was a gathering where all city-states participated. Many cities were rivals and often at odds with one another. The games provided an opportunity for these cities to compete through their best athletes. Despite the rivalry and tension, there was also a sense of unity, as only Greek citizens could compete and participate in the festival. This was particularly significant for the hundreds of Greek colonies that took part in the Olympics. During the 6th century BC, the city of Elis introduced the judges known as Hellenic, which translates to judges of the Greeks. Initially, only 2 judges were appointed, but by the 4th century BC, their number had increased to 10. The judges were selected by the rulers of Elis and served for a single term. They were chosen well in advance to prepare for the event. They would take an oath to ensure absolute fairness and unbiased judgment. They could be identified at the Olympics by their purple cloaks and wooden staffs. The tasks of these judges were extensive. They supervised the athletes, registered them, oversaw their training for 1 month, and disqualified those deemed unfit to compete. They also verified the athletes' Greek citizenship and origin. Additionally, they determined the winners, authorized offerings, and punished those caught cheating. Cheating was strictly prohibited at the Olympics. Various actions were considered cheating, such as attempting to bribe judges or competitors, causing fellow runners to stumble, or deceiving the judges. The typical punishment for cheating involved a heavy fine and public flogging, with the fines paid either by the athlete or their city-state. Well into the 5th century BC, the Olympic festival had become by far the most famous event. While the Olympics were highly renowned, there were also other PanHellenic festivals across ancient Greece. These were typically scheduled not to coincide with the Olympics. The major events included the Isthmian Games, dedicated to Poseidon, the Nemean Games, dedicated to Zeus, the Panathenea, dedicated to Athena, and the Pythia, dedicated to Apollo. The ancient Greek elites of the city-states embraced competition and eagerly participated in such events. Athletics had become a fundamental aspect of ancient Greek culture by this time, with nearly every city in Greece having a gymnasium and wrestling grounds. These were built by public funds and served primarily as places for men to exercise, but also as centers of worship, particularly for deities like Heracles. Gymnasiums were also recreational spaces where individuals could socialize with friends, recite poetry, and engage in philosophical discussions. In the subsequent centuries, and especially during the Hellenistic period, building a gymnasium in a city symbolized its Hellenization, highlighting the profound connection between ancient Greek culture and sports. Married women were not allowed to attend or participate in the Olympics. Only unmarried women were permitted to watch. However, there was one exception. The priestess of Demeter always had a prominent role in the event and was allowed to watch from a prestigious seat which resembled a throne. According to the law, the punishment for a married woman caught spectating the Olympics was to be thrown off a nearby cliff, although this penalty was likely never carried out. There was one famous case involving a woman named Cleopatra who disguised herself as a man to watch her son compete in the boxing event. When her son won, she cheered so passionately that her disguise was revealed, but she was pardoned because she came from a family of well-known Olympic winners. What married women could actually do at the Olympics was participate in the horse races. You might be wondering, how on earth was this possible? We will explain this in a few minutes when we analyze each sport in detail. There were some festivals in ancient Greece that allowed married women as spectators, but in most festivals this wasn't permitted. One notable female-only event in ancient Greece took place in the region of Olympia, known as the Heraea, established in honor of the goddess Hera. These games occurred a few weeks before the Olympics, taking place every 4 years and lasting for 1 day. The athletic event featured in the Heraea was the sprint race, and only unmarried women were allowed to compete. Men and women were permitted to spectate, and the women athletes wore a short tunic that exposed one breast, symbolizing either fertility or the mythical Amazon warriors. At the conclusion of the games, the winner received an olive wreath similar to the Olympics, and both spectators and athletes would partake in dancing and feasting. During the Archaic period, most city-states in Greece were ruled by aristocrats and oligarchs, with only a few under the rule of kings or archons. The aristocrats were the wealthiest individuals as they owned rich farmlands. Most of the men who competed in the Olympics belonged to the elite or upper class of ancient Greek society. This was due to two different reasons. Firstly, to participate in the Olympics, one needed to dedicate years to training and physical preparation, which was a privilege reserved for the wealthy. Many boys and men had to work daily throughout most of the year to support themselves and their families, leaving little time for rigorous athletic training. They also lacked the means to afford high-quality athletic education. The second reason for the participation of the aristocrats was the desire of each city's aristocracy to demonstrate superiority and worthiness through athletic competition, both to their counterparts and fellow citizens. However, there were numerous instances where non-wealthy people had the opportunity to compete in the Olympics. If a boy or man was deemed worthy, he would receive permission to train for the Olympics, with the state or a wealthy benefactor funding his training and supporting his family financially. This practice was not uncommon, as every city sought to prove itself worthy and took pride in showcasing talented athletes. Although training for the Olympics, passing the test and competing was a challenging feat, the rewards for success were numerous. Aside from receiving olive wreaths, the victors were honored and respected for life in the home state and throughout Greece. They received substantial wealth, were exempt from taxes, and could attain important political or military positions. In one notable instance, an Olympic victor returned to his home city, and his fellow citizens tore down part of the city walls in order for him to enter. It was a way of showing they trusted him to keep them safe, even more than their walls. A common practice for athletes or their cities was to commission statues depicting them, which were then dedicated to the gods and placed in temples at Olympia to celebrate the athletes' victories. The Olympics underwent many changes over the years. For narrative purposes, we will use the example of an Olympic festival from the 5th century BC to detail the procedures of the Games. Approximately 2 months before the start of the Games, heralds were sent from the city-state of Elis to all Greek cities and towns in order to announce the upcoming festival and proclaim the sacred truce. This truce forbade anyone from attacking Elis or harming travelers and pilgrims on their way to Olympia. Those traveling were considered to be under divine protection, and violating the truce was a major insult. Initially lasting for 1 month, the truce expanded over the years to 3 months. After the announcement, thousands of Greeks from all over the Mediterranean would start their journey to Olympia. Many traveled by boat, while others traveled through the mainland. One reason the festival took place during the summer was because it coincided with a period of reduced agricultural activity, allowing many people some free time to travel. Another reason was the relatively calmer waters in the sea during the summer. The Games were always scheduled to occur during the full moon nearest to the summer solstice. When the visitors arrived, they would settle around Olympia, sleeping in the open. Some had only a piece of cloth to lie down on, or used hammocks tied to trees. Wealthy people would set up their own tents. In some ways, it was very similar to a modern-day festival. In later years, a few inns were built inside Olympia, but these were only available to a very small number of wealthy visitors. The athletes competing in the Games during the festival would sleep outside like everyone else. This changed from the 3rd century BC onwards, as the athletes began to sleep in distinct buildings inside Olympia, similar to modern-day Olympic villages. A few days before the start of the festival, the Eleans would conduct meticulous checks to ensure everything was set and ready. The athletes were required to train in the city of Elis for 1 month prior to the Games, allowing judges to supervise their training and deem them worthy to compete in the Olympics. 1 day before the start of the Games, the athletes would process from Elis to Olympia. Officials would be in the front line, followed by the athletes along with the chariots and horses. During the night, they would rest and sleep near Olympia, reaching the festival the next day. When the procession arrived, it was met by the priests of Olympia. Together, they would enter the sacred altars amidst the roaring applause and cheering of the thousands of spectators who had come to witness the event. Afterwards, the athletes and judges would go to the assembly house, where they would sacrifice a boar in front of the statue of Zeus and swear their oaths. The athletes, along with their trainers, fathers and brothers, swore that they would do nothing to dishonor the Games. Additionally, they swore that they had been training for at least the past 10 months. The judges in turn swore that they would judge fairly and not accept bribes. After the oath, the participants rested, as they were scheduled to compete on the 2nd day of the festival. During the remainder of the first day, 2 competitions took place. The first was the trumpet competition, where the winner would earn the honor of playing the trumpet or the salpinx at all major events in the Olympics. The second contest was for town criers, with the winner becoming the official announcer of important updates during the Games. While these competitions were underway, the people had already filled every corner of Olympia. Merchants had set up stands and booths selling food and various items to the spectators. Poets, scholars, and other intellectuals delivered public lectures, engaging people from all over ancient Greece in discussions and conversations. Thus, the first day of the Olympics came to a close. The second day began with a grand procession of the contestants, accompanied by Olympic officials and priests, touring the various places of worship in Olympia and conducting animal sacrifices. Next came the first competition, the equestrian events, held in the hippodrome outside the altars. The main events included the 4-horse chariot race, the 2-horse chariot race, and the horse riding race. The chariot races were especially spectacular and captivated the audience like no other. It is important to note that horse riding back then was quite different from later years. Riders had no saddles, only a patch of cloth to sit on, and there were no stirrups or horseshoes. Chariots lacked safety measures, with the charioteer relying solely on the reins and at risk of falling off easily if not careful. One fascinating aspect was the starting mechanism created for the equestrian races. It was created in order to make sure that the starting procedure would be fair for everyone. The mechanism had a triangular shape with ropes fastened between the edges of the track. In front of the first chariot stood a bronze dolphin. At the sound of a trumpet, a bronze eagle would rise and the dolphin would drop, initiating the race. The ropes then began to fall one by one, starting from the back, and the consecutive ropes were released as soon as the chariots reached them. The chariots that started first had the advantage of speed, but the chariots which started last had the advantage of taking the turn safely and steady when they began the race. Chariot positions were determined by lot to ensure fairness. Another interesting fact about the equestrian races was that if a 4-horse chariot, or horse in the case of riding races, won, the victor was considered to be the owner of the horses, not the rider or charioteer. Owners rarely participated in the races as they employed trained slaves for that purpose. While riders were cheered on during competition, honors and prizes were bestowed upon the owners. Only the wealthy could afford horses, as they required vast amounts of land for grazing, an aspect that kept the equestrian events exclusive to the aristocracy and the elite. Although married women were prohibited from participating in the Olympics, many city-states allowed women to own property, including horses. Therefore, women occasionally submitted their horses for the races, and if they won, they were hailed as victors despite the fact that they were not there and their names were inscribed on victory statues in Olympia. After the equestrian event followed the pentathlon, which was a combination of 5 sports: the javelin, the discus, wrestling, the stadion, and the long jump. This event took place in the stadion, which was filled with up to 40,000 spectators at its peak. These sports were largely similar to their modern counterparts, with a few key differences. The discuses were made of bronze, the javelins were made of wood, and athletes in the long jump carried hand weights. The stadion race, though, is not included in the modern Olympics. It was a 200-meter sprint and considered the most sacred event in the Olympics, as it was the first established competition with the athletes running in honor of Zeus. As we mentioned earlier, each Olympiad was named after the winner of the stadion race. During all Olympic events except the equestrian ones, the contestants competed naked. They also trained naked, which may seem strange to us today, but in ancient Greece, displaying the body's physical prowess in its entirety was seen as valiant. Particularly in the classical and Hellenistic periods, brave soldiers and heroes were often depicted nude as a form of artistic admiration. In reality, of course, soldiers did not go naked into battle. The athletes at the Olympics competed without clothes, but in many other festivals, wearing a loincloth was mandatory. While nudity was admired in the contexts of athletics and war, public nudity was uncommon and viewed as dishonorable or brutish. In the afternoon, after the pentathlon concluded, a priest would sacrifice a black ram to Pelops, the hero of the mythical chariot race, marking the end of the second day. The third day began with the foot races, which included 3 different events. The first race was the long-distance run, where runners started from the same spot and completed 12 laps around the stadium, covering a total distance of approximately 5 kilometers or 3 miles. Next was the sprint race, in which athletes ran from one end of the stadium to the other, covering approximately 200 meters or 700 feet. The final event of the foot races was the double pipe race, where contestants started from different points and completed a full lap around the stadium, finishing back at their starting positions. This race was approximately 400 meters or 1300 feet long. When the foot races concluded, thousands of spectators, priests, athletes, judges, and officials gathered in the altars to perform the hecatomb ceremony, where 100 oxen were sacrificed in honor of the gods. After the sacrifice, the cooked meat would be distributed to everyone and a great feast would follow, lasting until late at night. The fourth day began with the heavy events held in the stadium, which included 3 different competitions. The first event was wrestling. The athletes started by grasping each other's hands, with their foreheads touching, and circled around, looking for an advantage. There were numerous ways for a wrestler to defeat their opponent. Each athlete was allowed 2 penalties. A penalty was given to an opponent if a wrestler pushed them outside the ring, or if a wrestler's chest, back, stomach, or shoulders touched the ground. Another penalty was given if a wrestler admitted defeat while in a lock hold. If a contestant received 3 penalties, they would lose the match. Moves like biting or attacking the genitals were forbidden, but other potentially dangerous blows that would be considered unacceptable today were allowed. Wrestling was extremely popular not only in the Olympics but also in nearly all athletic festivals throughout ancient Greece. The second sport of the heavy events was boxing. This event differed from its modern counterpart as the contestants did not wear boxing gloves but rather leather wraps tied around their hands. In later years, a leather knuckle pad was added, making the sport even more dangerous. Boxers would strike each other until one admitted defeat. These matches could last a long time, and sometimes a boxer could pass out. Only punches to the head were allowed, and the sport was very brutal. The third and final sport of the heavy events was the pankration, which combined elements of boxing and wrestling along with its unique characteristics. The pankration was a full-contact martial art where most techniques to defeat the opponent were permitted, including punching in various parts of the body, kicking and tripping the opponent. The pankration consisted of 2 main phases: the upper pankration, where athletes fought upright, and the lower pankration, where they fought mostly on the ground. The goal was to repeatedly damage the opponent until they admitted defeat. The athletes of the heavy events were very popular in the Olympics and often toured throughout the many other athletic festivals of ancient Greece. The heavy events were also the games in which most non-wealthy people participated. There were even cases where one athlete would win all 3 of the heavy events. Usually, those who won consecutively became celebrities in the athletic world and could also acquire great wealth from participating in local events in various cities. The trainers of the athletes in the heavy events were highly esteemed, with some even depicted in statues placed in Olympia. Many times, athletes achieved victory due to their trainers' professional and successful coaching. Trainers often supported their athletes from the bench or stands by shouting advice. There is a specific event where a trainer, wishing to boost his athlete's morale, shouted that the girl he loves would only marry an Olympic victor. This tactic worked and the athlete won the match. However, he was later rejected by the girl's father and thus did not marry her after all. After the heavy events, another competition would take place, known as the race in armor. Men wearing war helmets, greaves, and sometimes body armor, while also carrying a bronze shield, competed in a foot race around the entire stadium, which, as we previously mentioned, was a distance of 400 meters or 1300 feet. The most challenging aspect of this race was carrying the shield, which weighed around 7 kilograms or 15 pounds. This event was one of the last to be added to the Olympics around the 6th century BC. The next and final competition of the Olympics was the boys' event, where boys or very young men would compete against each other in the stadium race, wrestling, pentathlon, boxing, and from the end of the 3rd century BC onwards in pankration too. The ages varied from 12 to 19 years, and because of this, they were split into 3 separate age groups to ensure fair competition. These games were adapted to suit the capabilities of the boys, with the pentathlon using smaller discuses and javelins, and the heavy event being much less dangerous compared to the men's competitions. This event nurtured the athletic spirit of young men, preparing them to become great athletes once they were old enough to compete in the men's sports. The 5th and final day of the Olympics was solely dedicated to celebrations. The victors of all events would walk from the stadium to the temple of Zeus with ribbons tied around their heads. During this procession, they were cheered on by thousands of spectators who threw flowers at them while singing victory hymns. Each athlete would then be called forward to receive their rewards, similar to modern-day Olympic winners, but instead of receiving medals, they would be crowned with olive wreaths amidst the cheering crowd. Following the awards ceremony, a great feast concluded the Olympics. With the Roman conquest of Greece in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, many changes occurred in the Olympics. Despite their violent conquest, the Romans respected and greatly admired Greek culture. They decided to invest in Olympia by helping to repair buildings and funding the games, especially as the city of Elis was lacking resources during that period. After this, the Romans began to compete in the games as well, marking a transition from the Olympics being exclusively Greek to becoming somewhat international, as the Roman Republic and later the Empire would expand throughout the Mediterranean. Despite these changes and the inevitable partial decline of the event, Olympia remained famous, with Roman emperors often visiting the festival. However, in the 2nd century AD, the festival began to experience a significant decline. The number of visitors dropped massively and many buildings were left unrepaired, resulting in their collapse. This decline was attributed to the numerous changes that took place within the Roman Empire throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. By then, the empire had expanded from Western Europe to the Middle East and Africa, and hundreds of festivals like the Olympics had emerged in various cities, particularly in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire that were part of the Greek world. The journey to Olympia, whether by sea or land, was often difficult and very long. As a result, people began to prefer visiting nearby festivals and games that were gaining fame. Furthermore, the ancient Greek gods were beginning to be pushed aside, as the interaction between the East and the West gave rise to many new religions. Some examples include the cult of Mithras, the Greco-Egyptian cults, and of course, the rising religion of Christianity. The instability of the region also affected Olympia, as the Greek mainland was often raided by invaders. Additionally, the Olympic Games had lost much of their original character, since there were no more independent Greek city-states gathering to both compete and bond with one another while honoring their gods. The Roman rule of Greece, the fusion of Western and Eastern cultures, the massive economic problems, the growth of many new festivals, the original instability, and the rise of numerous new religions were all causes that led to the decline of the Olympics. When Christianity finally prevailed in the Roman Empire, pagan religions were initially pushed aside and later persecuted. In the year 393 AD, Emperor Theodosius I banned all pagan festivals throughout the empire, including the Olympic Games, which by then had declined even further and were but a mere shadow of the former selves. In the 6th century AD, the remaining buildings in Olympia were destroyed by a great earthquake. Not long after, the river Alpheus flooded the region, submerging underwater the legendary city of the Olympic Games. Although pagan festivals were banned, athletic events continued in the Eastern Roman Empire for quite some time, with equestrian races becoming the main event in the new capital of Constantinople. Nevertheless, the culture centered around athletics and the gymnasium faded and slowly passed into history.